Can you hear me? Thank you. Before I read the word, there's three words this morning that I know you felt and I felt. Behold our God. You're right here. This morning, a friend who's on mission in Uganda sent a worship video from today, which was probably 12 hours ago in Uganda. And they were worshiping in Uganda. And as you might know, the Ugandans, they get into it, and the missionaries were just taking it all in. And I think about in the United States, in Washington, all of the services that are going on right now where they're worshiping, behold our God. They're all worshiping. And across the United States and across the world, the nations are singing his praise. It's when you think about that, it just makes you behold our God. And I also want to give an opportunity to say good morning, Ginny. We love you. We're going to read three different scriptures out of Daniel this morning. One is Daniel 1 through 2. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And in Daniel 6, 25 and 27, then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. In the last verse, Daniel 9:4. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. The word of the Lord.
You may be seated, and kids are dismissed at this time.
Good morning, Lake Taps. The weather this past week was less apocalyptic. So there we go, and it's very appropriate since we're wrapping up the book of Daniel. It's almost as though we should be wishing everyone congratulations. We made it through the book of Daniel. Not every church, that's one thing I love about Lake Taps. We go really chapter by chapter, book. We do the whole book. There are many, just for me, as I did a cursory look at different churches, how they navigated the book of Daniel, many churches just stop at chapter 6. They're like, we're going to stay there. We're going to stay with the fiery furnace and the lions. And I don't know if we can get into the beasts and the horns. And so there we go. And this is the last sermon in the book of Daniel. We're wrapping up. And we're going to look at one question. And so let me just put a question right out to you from the beginning that we're going to zoom in on. And the question is, we've given this title, Living with Strong Faith in a Strange Land. But now, looking back, the question for all of us to answer in some way is, how do we then live with strong faith in a strange land? Given all the data, the life stories, the tumult, the ebbs and flows of what we see in Daniel, then how do we, in terms of the takeaway, for us, what does it mean, 21st century, friends of Jesus, Christ followers, South Puget Sound area, what does it look like to live with strong faith in a strange land? We're going to get to that. Now, Before we get there, let me just do a quick recap for maybe some of you who might just be piping in today, maybe just visiting, or weren't able to capture the whole series. Let me just do a quick recap, a few minutes long, and then come back, and we're going to spend the greater portion of this time looking at that question: how do we live with strong faith in a strange land? So here's the thing about Daniel. A big picture is it's really a tale of two kingdoms. Kingdoms, the one kingdom is really kingdoms plural in terms of earthly kingdoms, and then the other kingdom is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdoms that we see outlined and portrayed for us in the book of Daniel are Babylon, Persia, Greece. And then the drop-down menu from those two things are, one, the kings. There are kings within that kingdom. And then there's a king over here, the king of heaven. The king of heaven now we know as the Lord Jesus Christ. And what we discover is that in these kingdoms, there's one that actually is very unstable. Those are the earthly kingdoms. Unstable, they're finite. They have an expiry date. They will end. And then there's a kingdom of heaven that actually will never end, which we just read for us in chapter 6 of Daniel. So one kingdom is stable, one kingdom is not stable. One kingdom will last till the very end. One kingdom actually will just not last till the very end. We see this almost punctuated in chapter 5, verse 30, where Babylon is in its twilight, and eventually it falls. Chapter 5, verse 30, we read these words, actually quite poignant in terms of describing how a kingdom will fall. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So the guy who actually holds the power in his kingdom, the king, was killed. That's a pretty dramatic way of saying how the mightiest kingdom in his day, Babylon, at its zenith, fell. When Pete spoke to us during the sermon series, he made a point of reminding us that Daniel is about an everlasting kingdom, a kingdom that will never be destroyed, a kingdom of righteousness and justice. Now, all this kingdom language, which is prevalent throughout the book of Daniel, it's worth just pausing here for a moment, because if we're not careful, we can get lost in sort of just 6th century BC in a disconnect. There's this chasm between 6th century BC and 21st century Washington State, or wherever we live, Lake Taps, Bonnie Lake, Auburn, Puyallup, wherever. There's a big gap because we're not living in Babylon, ancient Iraq, we're living here. So how do we bridge that gap? I want to suggest to you that actually that metaphor of kingdoms is very apt. It can be a bridge building point for us. And let me tell you why. Because what was true of 6th century Babylon, that the mightiest kingdoms will fall, is still true today. Now just think of power and kingdoms in our day right now. We might think of countries. We might think of geographical areas. We might think of the West. We have a long history now of being powerful in the West, and in many ways have contributed positively to the globe, really. But that could be one spot where we think that's power, that's a kingdom. It could be America as we think of a kingdom there. We could think of China, and the list goes on in terms of earthly kingdoms. Or we could think of just corporations, businesses that actually are a kingdom in one way. As I was giving thought to this, I thought of Amazon. And the reason why is because there was an interview. I forget if I told this story or used the story before, but this story told of Jeff Bezos back in 2018. And he was interviewed. He actually had an all-hands meeting with some of his staff in light of Sears going bankrupt. And so he was asked the question about Amazon, what he thought of Amazon, what he thought of what he made of all the news of Sears filing for bankruptcy. And this is what he said. Now remember, this Amazon, he's speaking of Amazon. At that point, it was just shy of $1 trillion in value. The president, Jeff Bezos, said this: Amazon is not too big to fail. In fact, I predict one day Amazon will fail. Amazon will go bankrupt. If you look at large companies, their lifespans tend to be 30 plus years, not 100 plus years. And if that weren't enough, he continued. He said, if we start to focus on ourselves instead of focusing on our customers, that will be the beginning of the end. We have to try and delay that day for as long as possible. Isn't that interesting? Here's a guy, president of this massively influential company, saying, yeah, we actually have an expiry date. We will end. We will go bankrupt. We will fail. The mission then is to prolong our life as much as possible, because we will end. I mean, it's pretty staggering what he said there. And the journalists there who were recording this, they were shocked just as well as the many people who collect their paycheck from Amazon. But there is another kingdom that will not fail. And it doesn't actually rely on us feeding the beast. It actually is centered around, it orbits around a king who will not fail. Kings of this world, the kingdom of heaven. Now, to keep bridging this gap to see how actually we're not so different to Babylon, let's think of the location, because the location is almost just as important as the content that we see in Daniel, because Babylon is not too different to our modern day here in wherever we live, South Puget Sound area. Babylon, as we've talked about many times, it was a spectacular city. It would have been looked upon as this university kind of city. It led the world in terms of its size. It was the largest city in the world at its time. It led the world when it came to innovation, architecture, education, medicine, engineering, all these things. And when we think of our world, we're not too different, particularly when we think of America. I mean, we lead the world in many ways on a global scale, but think of actually closer to home, here in Washington, in Seattle, in the greater Seattle area. What has happened in this place that has actually caused ripples across the globe? You think of Microsoft. Microsoft has changed globally how we work. It started here. Costco, Amazon has changed globally how we shop. Starbucks has changed globally and started here how we meet, how we relate with each other. Boeing started here, has changed globally how we travel. That has all happened here. Now, here's why I say all these things. Because if we think of where we live, how actually, believe it or not, yes, there is disparity. There are people who are not doing well financially. But generally speaking, in our local context, with all the knowledge, affluence, economic and social capital, we can see that similar to Babylon, it becomes increasingly easy to not need God. Because we have so much. In that way, we're actually not that different to Babylon. Let me repeat that. We have an increasingly hard job seeing God as relevant. That pinpoints some of the similarity we have to Babylonian culture. Perhaps Genesis 11, verse 1 to 4 pinpoints our similarity, because that's where we read in the first sermon the origin of Babylon. This is what it says. This is sort of the foundation of Babylon, how it got started. Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, and here's the rub, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." So much of that statement, "Come, let us make a name for ourselves," captures the cultural mood for us today. Identity, this search for identity, this search for meaning, but it's a search for meaning detached from God. That's the key. That we can do all these things, we have the same longings, the same proclivities, the same desires, the same tendencies as they did back in 6th century BC, and especially when it comes to this search for meaning, making a name for ourselves, but detached from God. We see that certainly in the different social media platforms, but it's more than just social media. It's actually just in the cultural air. Searching for meaning detached from God. Now, the other piece is actually worship. That we aren't like Babylon. Babylon was packed. It was rammed with temples. We don't have that. I mean, if you pull out of the street, you see a gas station, a coffee, espresso bar down there. You don't see temples. But temples signified not just buildings, bricks and mortar, but actually signified worship. And we might not be religious in the same way, and that's an important point. We might not have all these temples, but we are the same in terms of worshiping. Just by reiterating what I mentioned when we looked at this passage weeks ago, worship is not a temple thing. It's actually more of an attention. Who are we giving our attention to? Who's ruling our life? This is what the writer David Foster Wallace, he's passed away too young, but a great writer. This is what he said in one of his commencement speeches. He said, and he wasn't a Christian. He said, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. So, hopefully by now, slowly, just by way of recap, we're going to get to the question here that hopefully bridges the chasm that we might see between 6th century BC and 21st century here in Washington State. That actually we're not that different. We actually are not worlds apart. We're worshipers still. We're on the search for meaning, but the cultural zeitgeist, the cultural air in which that we inhabit is very much search for meaning without God. There's still idolatry, and this is not even mentioning a lot of the lines that come from John Lennox's book that we put out throughout the series, this idea of idolatry, taking the absolute and relativizing the absolute, and taking the relative and absolutizing the relative. How Daniel, this is Lennox's great one-liners, he said, Daniel lived in Babylon, but he did not live for Babylon. Daniel lived in Babylon, but he didn't let Babylon get inside of him. Those are great lines that capture a lot of Daniel. We just keep going and keep going. There's so many things we could talk through this morning, but really I want to focus all the thoughts. I want to tie the thoughts this morning around the question, how can we live then with strong faith in a strange land? Let me pray. Father, in these next few minutes, I ask you to speak to us. Help us to hear your voice. I pray that it would be more than just information just being distilled and data that's interesting or for some maybe boring, but actually be more than that, Lord. I pray that you'd speak to us, open our ears, help our hearts to be tender to you, and I pray that it would be more than informational, it would be transformational in these moments. So come by your Holy Spirit, speak to us, God, in your name, for your glory. Amen. So let me put the cart before the horse here. I want to suggest that in order for us to live with strong faith in a strange land, it's going to happen by having an intimate knowledge of God. That's one way of answering the question in light of the book of Daniel. How are we going to live with strong faith in a strange land? Well, Daniel shows actually one of the main ways, at least the starting point is going to be by actually capturing and engaging in an intimate knowledge of God. You see, cognitive knowledge is good, but it's not good enough. It's good, but it's not sufficient. We need personal knowledge. Personal knowledge. Let me put it this way. If you were to ask me, Nathan, do you know who Justin Bieber is? Now, me being Canadian, of course I know who Justin Bieber is. I know the church he went to, all these. Anyway, the point is, I know who he is. But if you were to ask me, do you know who Brian Peterson is? I'll be able to say yes, but actually the difference is the yes to the second person has a lot more to it because I know Brian personally. I don't know Justin Bieber. He's just a celebrity to me. I know of him, but I don't know him personally. And when it comes to the book of Daniel, what we see is actually cognitive knowledge only gets you so far. Daniel exemplified, he embodied a personal knowledge. There was a personal relationship that he had with God that would get him through the storms. It would get him through the fire of life. Now, we're going to come back to that personal knowledge in a few moments. But that's the answer to this question. How do we live with strong faith in a strange land? It's going to happen, at least the starting point is going to be by actually having intimate knowledge of God. Now, before we get there, let's talk through this question almost just bit by bit. And let's just slow it down. So I want to first look at how can we live? So before we actually fill it out by saying, how can we live with strong faith? First of all, how can we live? And the answer is looking at Daniel. For Daniel, living in Babylon was not just barely surviving. There was a vitality to how Daniel lived in exile. We see this in chapter 1 when he actually refrains. He says he will not be defiled by the king's food, the king's wine. In chapter 1, verse 15, he says, and then chapter 1, verse 15, it tells us the end result. So after Daniel has said, I will not be defiled by the king's food, the king's wine, this is what we see as a description of the end game. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they, that's Daniel and his friends, were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. I want to suggest to you that can act as a metaphor, that picture of Daniel and his friends having all these vital signs. That can act as a metaphor to faith, Daniel's faith in exile. There was a vibrant and strong quality to his faith. Now let's just stop there for a moment, because if we're not careful, when we think of Daniel's faith, we might have a disproportionate amount of focus on Daniel himself, as opposed to the object of his faith. So to this point, we talked about Daniel living very quickly, but we talked about Daniel, how he lived, but it wasn't just barely making it through. It was actually this vitality that he had to his faith. But the question is, what made Daniel's faith so strong? Was it Daniel was just this almost superhuman guy, almost a mythological creature, and we're somehow to capture what he did and put it into practice? I want to suggest to you that's not necessarily how faith works from a scriptural standpoint. What made Daniel's faith so strong? That's an important question to look at. Now, we have to do a quick refresher on what faith is, how we understand faith through a biblical lens, through a scriptural lens. What is faith? Now, Richard Dawkins is well known for his book, The God Delusion, written almost 20 years ago now. He's an atheist, well-known atheist out of England, and he has famously said at different points, faith is believing in someone or something that does not exist. Faith is believing in someone or something that does not exist. Now, if you think of that, that is actually how many people think of faith in terms of Christian faith, religious faith, at a popular level. So if we just sort of do that, how they see us kind of category, like how do people see Christians? Like, let's think about that for a moment. Well, I don't know about you, but when I talk to many of my friends who are not Christian, they think of me as, Nathan, you have faith. You're crazy, but you have faith. And that's really amazing. You've sort of left your brain behind, but I admire your courage. You're really bold. Maybe, the elevator doesn't go to the top for you, but I really admire your courage, because faith for them is actually, they might not say it in that kind of way, but they do think of faith as, you believe in something that isn't really there. You believe in something that does not exist. Now, that actually is one definition, but it's not the biblical definition of faith. The biblical definition of faith is actually baseline. It's a response to reality. So baseline is actually, when we say faith, faith is believing in God. He actually exists. But more than that, he's trustworthy. And we can apply this in many ways. If I say I have faith in Perry Maxfield, what I'm saying baseline is actually I believe Perry exists. But more than that, I'm actually saying I can trust him. That is what we mean in a very shorthand version of what faith in God is all about. Faith in God. Daniel's faith in God was actually a response to reality, meaning he believed God exists, but also he was trustworthy. Daniel could bank on him. Now we're getting closer to Daniel's faith. What made Daniel's faith so strong? Martin Luther was very clear in Martin Luther was one of the great reformers. He talked about faith and how it's very important to actually locate the emphasis of faith not in the intensity of how one believes, but the object of that person's belief. So faith is not so much concerned with the intensity with which a person believes, but the object of that person's trust. So the question then becomes not, how much faith do you have? Do you have enough faith? That's not the million-dollar question. The question is, in whom have you placed your trust? That's the question. I mean, frankly, we're all duped if life comes down to how much faith. Do you have enough faith? No, the question is actually, who have you placed your trust in? My theology professor, a guy named Alistair McGrath, once put it like this: the efficacy of faith does not rest upon the intensity with which we believe, but in the reliability of the one in whom we believe. Let me repeat that. The efficacy, in other words, the strength, the lifelineness of it, the robust quality of faith does not rest upon the intensity with which we believe, but in the reliability of the one in whom we believe. This is what made Daniel's faith so strong. Not because he was a superhuman guy. Yes, he was a remarkable guy in terms of his fortitude, his steadfastness, his wisdom, his intensity, but that's not what made his faith strong. No, what made Daniel's faith strong was the fact that the source of his trust was rock solid. Now, to get to the bottom of Daniel's trust in God, we need to then move not only from how he lived, and how that corresponds to faith, living with strong faith. Those two are linked, but then actually faith goes down to what is it rooted in? What was his faith rooted in? And then we have to ask the question, who is God? because we're getting to the source of the faith, then we're actually now looking at, okay, how is God described in Daniel? Now, I don't know if you've ever answered that question for yourself, just thinking through, who is God? If someone were to ask you who is God, what would you say to that? It's a good question. Perhaps, it has to be near the top of the list in terms of understanding our faith. Who is God? Now, I'll never forget, for me personally, early on when I was an itinerant apologist and speaker, I was speaking with a colleague at a Midwestern university in Canada. And in the Q&A, a student came to the microphone and he said, look, you guys have been talking about God the last 30, 40 minutes here. Define him. Define God. And I'll tell you, if anyone was ever looking for the exit door, that was me in that moment. Because I'm up there with my colleague, and this guy, the guy at the microphone, he has the darts, and we're the dartboard. And I'll never forget, my colleague said, that is a wonderful question. I have my colleague here, Nathan Betts, who will be able to answer that question for you. And I looked at him, I said, you rascal, you're getting dinner after this. He was definitely picking up the tab on the meal after. But now here's the thing. I'm not going to go into actually how I answer that question, because there's a philosophical, theological dimension to that, and we could go into how God by definition is the uncreated one. All these different, which are important. It's true. It's very important to actually work through all those details. But eventually, from a Christian perspective, we have to come to the answer that God is how he's revealed himself. Because God has revealed himself to us in the person of Jesus. But here in the Old Testament, here in Daniel, God actually reveals something of who he is, what his character is, what he is like. And let me just work through that. Who is God according to Daniel? Well, we go from the beginning of the book. God is sovereign. God is sovereign. We heard read for us Daniel 1, verses 1 to 2. And this is almost ground zero for seeing the sovereignty of God in Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. That's so incredibly interesting, because for people in exile was a result of sin. It was a result of idolatry. We see all those warnings in Jeremiah, how sin has an end game, and that end game for them would be exile. And so now they are in exile because of their sin. But the interesting part is the fact that for many of them, they probably would have thought, it wouldn't have been a far-off inference to think that God has actually just been beaten. He's lost to this juggernaut called Babylon. Babylon has toppled God's power. Now we're really lost. But actually what we see here is that's actually not at all what's true, because Nebuchadnezzar did not just topple God. No, actually God gave Jerusalem over to Nebuchadnezzar. Nothing can be taken from God without him giving it. And that pinpoints the sovereignty of God. From the very beginning of Daniel, God is sovereign. He gave Jerusalem over to Babylon. God is sovereign. Then we see, and as we move to chapter 6, which is also read for us, that God is living. In Daniel 6, we see the story of the lion's den. And just by way of recall, an important detail here, the lion's den was not a situation where it's like, you know what, if you go to the lion's den, you could get a good day. And the lions might not be hungry today. They actually might just be sleeping. But sorry, dude, we got to actually get to the lion's den. No, it was like lion's den was like, you are cooked. That is your, whatever you need to do, take care of it, because you are done now. And it's in light of that Darius gives this pronouncement of God. It's also not just the lion's den that he's witnessed, how it was like, this doesn't happen. Someone doesn't go to lion's den and come back. They don't come back from that. But also Darius was the first ruler under the Persian Empire. So he would have just seen Babylon, this enormously powerful empire, fall. And after he sees two of these things happen, both close up, the kingdom of Babylon falling and Daniel being rescued, he says this: God's kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion shall have no end. God delivers and rescues. God works signs and wonders. he not only points out, just going back a bit, that Daniel's God is a living God. Why would that be important, that Daniel's God is the living God? Well, because Darius knew actually many gods all the gods he knew were not living. They were shaped by human hands. Metal, made of wood, made of stone. And here he says, actually, there's something different about your God, Daniel. He actually lives. And then he does this contrast. And the interesting thing is, baked into what Darius is saying there is a contrast to another kingdom that is completely different and that is actually able to do the things that he himself and Babylon and Persia are not able to do. So he says, God's kingdom will never be destroyed. He knows Babylon has actually just been destroyed. God's kingdom shall have no end. Babylon's dominion has just ended. Verse 27, God delivers and rescues. Darius has just experienced how he actually has very limited power, how he's not able to deliver and rescue. God works signs and wonders, and Darius clearly, he's not able to perform such acts. So Daniel, in this moment, to this point, has experienced God as sovereign, in that he holds everything together, but he's also shown himself, in the words of Darius, as the living God, whose kingdom will never be destroyed, will never end, and he is a God who rescues his people. And then there's more. Chapter 9, we see something of Daniel's theology, how he views God, by how he talks to God. In Daniel 9, verse 4, we read that God is one who keeps covenant. He keeps his promises. We can trust him because he keeps his promises, but also God keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. And we talked a lot when we looked at chapter 9, we discovered that actually those two words in the English, that term steadfast love and covenant, they go together. Historically, in the Jewish community, they would always go together. What's really interesting, because we looked at that, if you remember, we looked at that word, a term steadfast love. How in the English, from the Hebrew word is chesed, and steadfast love is the best capturing, but it's still very, just not sufficient in capturing the profundity and the weight and the enormity of what that word chesed means in the Hebrew. And for me, it was perfect timing, because after that Sunday where we looked at Daniel 9, the next day I was meeting with an Old Testament scholar named Bruce Waltke. And he's written so much, he just almost has encyclopedic knowledge of the Old Testament. And I talked to him about this word, chesed. And he said to me, and that's that steadfast love here we see in Daniel 9, he said this, the word chesed is bound by covenant and is used often where the helpless is being helped. Now just think for a moment. Of all the words, of all the descriptions Daniel could have used when he described God in that prayer in Daniel 9, he called out this word chesed, which actually not only has covenantal weight to it, but that also means you are a God who helps the helpless. And if ever there were people who actually were helpless, it was this community, the Jewish community, in exile. Everything was beyond their power. They were helpless. And Daniel's calling out God. He's making a theological statement. He's saying, you are a God who helps the helpless. In so many ways, it makes sense of actually now, as we move to the strange land, we come to the theology. We talk about how Daniel lived, how he lived with strong faith, and what that meant, strong faith meant, and how the strong faith was rooted in this theology of a God who is sovereign, he lives, he keeps covenant, he is steadfast in love. But the strangeness of this land is that actually we are helpless. Part of being in exile feels that we have this feeling of being helpless, that the social, the cultural, the moral moorings that we once had, that were just almost permanent furniture pieces, that almost supported our faith, or at least were warm to our faith, are no longer. And so now we have this sense of living in a strange land. We have this feeling of helplessness. Why? Because our faith is homeless. We don't know where to put our faith in terms of our land. There's this rootless quality to our faith right now. That is very much life in exile. Now, let me just slow it down here for a moment, because it's worth thinking through what I mean, we mean when we use the word helpless. Because when I look out here, when we talk to each other, for most of us, we wouldn't say, I'm helpless right now. We don't feel that way. But here it's worth talking through the human condition. Because so much of the human condition is that we are weak, we are frail, and we need someone outside of ourselves to help us. But that is held in tension with this reality that actually we can do a lot. We can manage the situations, we can put the fires out, we can figure out, we can get enough money, we can get enough education, we have the social capital, on and on it goes. We actually have a lot of resources. We can figure stuff out. So in a sense, we're not helpless, but are we? Let me just sort of use different metaphors and analogies to sort of bring this point home as I land it here. Often something that is said against Christians, I've heard it said many, many times, is, I understand you have this faith, but Nathan, faith is a crutch. Your faith in God is a crutch. Now, have you ever thought what that statement actually means? Because it's actually seen, the faith in that way is certainly seen as a pejorative, like you're weak. And I'm not like that, so I don't need the crutch. But there's actually theological substance to that statement, believe it or not, even though that's a backhanded sort of compliment. It's actually just a dig, really. Because the answer, in one way, as Christians, we can say, yes, it is a crutch, because actually I know that I need to lean on something. I'm weak. I'm broken. That's the nature of the human condition. We are frail. We are fractured. We are broken. That's the nature of sin and its outworking in this world, in our hearts. The question is not, okay, I have a crutch, you don't. No, we all have a crutch, so to speak. We all have something that we lean on. The question is, do you lean on something that can hold you? Is your crutch strong enough? That is the question. That is part of understanding how, in one sense, yeah, we have all these resources, but we too, in life today, we are helpless. There's this helplessness to life. So what do we do with all this? What do we do with all this information from Daniel? I want to suggest to you that almost the big picture answer is we come to him. It's very simple. We just come to Jesus. Come to him and bring ourselves to him. And when we come to him, we understand him like Daniel understood him, as a God who is sovereign. He holds everything together. He is living. He speaks. He listens. He interacts with us. He is a God who keeps covenant. He loves us. He has steadfast love towards us. He is helping us, the helpless. In so many ways, this is seen not only in the Old Testament, but perhaps supremely, most profoundly, in the life of Jesus. In Luke 15, one of the biographies of Jesus, we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Luke's Gospel, chapter 15, we hear the story, we know the story of the prodigal son. Now, many commentators, I think, rightfully argued that actually that's mistitled, because the story is not really about the son. The story is about the father. Because in this story, Jesus tells, it's a story pointing to him, pointing to God and his love. Jesus tells a story of a son who squanders away his inheritance. And that in itself, in Middle Eastern culture, in first century Palestine, that would have been a slap in the face, needless to say, to actually ask for the inheritance while the father is still alive. And the father grants him this. The son takes the inheritance, travels a distance far away, and he squanders all the money, and then he realizes he needs to come back. So he comes back, but in his coming back, he scripts something to himself how he will have a speech ready for his father and plead with his father for mercy so that he can come back and be accepted in the home. He will even work for his father now. If he can be as equal as one of his servants, he would love that. Never mind coming back to just being his son. When he comes back, Jesus tells his audience, his listeners, that actually the father not only walks to him or accepts him, he runs to the son. That would be, in Middle Eastern culture in that day, it would have been so undignifying for the father to do that. The listeners who would have heard Jesus tell the story, they would have been almost mortified and shocked that Jesus is telling a story about a father who actually, no, fathers don't do that. They have dignity. They will not do that kind of thing. That son should get a slap on the face. The father doesn't run to him. the Father runs to him, and it tells us something of the love of God, this steadfast love. There's a story told by a guy named Ian McLaren. Ian McLaren was a Scottish priest, but he also wrote, I believe he wrote fiction, and he tells a story about a daughter coming home to a father. She had a fractured relationship with her father, and he tells a story to give perspective to the story of the prodigal son. This is how he puts it. Flora Campbell was a daughter, and she came home. When she reached the door, her strength had departed, and she was not able to knock. She could hear her father feeling for the latch, which for once could not be found, and saying nothing but, "Flora, Flora." She had made up some kind of speech, but the only word she ever said was, "Father." For Lachlan, who had never even kissed her all the days of her youth, clasped her in his arms and sobbed out blessings over her head. Flora told her friend afterwards that in the Gaelic there are 50 words for darling, and that her father called her by every one of them the night she came home. And thus her carefully prepared speech was interrupted, and like the speech of the prodigal, was immeasurably improved by the interruption. Of all the words this father could find in the Gaelic, he ransacked the dictionary and called her every word for darling he could find to express his love for his daughter coming home. That is the kind of love that you and I have been given by the Lord Jesus. This steadfast love that Daniel held on to, he was able to hang on to that, and because of it, it got him through the storm. When we come to know him, we know him not only in his greatness, but the more we see him, the more we also see ourselves. The more we see ourselves. Here's how one person put it. This is a guy named Douglas Copeland, not a Christian. And in his memoir, he put it like this: "My secret is that I need God. That I am sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem to be capable of giving. To help me be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness. To help me love as I seem beyond being able to love. My secret is that I need God." The more we come to know him, the more we come to see him in his greatness, that he has loved us like no one else could love us. He runs to us. But the more we see him, yes, the more we come to know him. But in knowing him, we also see ourselves as we really are, that we need him. We are in need. We are weak. The pastor and author Tim Keller puts it like this, so beautiful. You and I are more sinful and flawed than you ever dared believe, but more accepted and loved than you ever dared hope. You and I are more sinful than we ever dared believe, but we are more accepted and loved than we ever dared hope. That is the love of Jesus. The love of the Father who runs after us. Have you ever wondered why the Father was running? I want to suggest to you there's an aspect in us because of sin that actually wants to run away from God. So I wonder in that story, the reason why the Father was running after him is because he was saying, "I'm never going to let you go now. You're mine. I'm going after you." Because that is the nature of God's love, to chase after us, even when we are running away from him. So maybe the first step this morning is simply coming back, renewing our commitment, saying, "God, I'm coming. I'm going to stop running. I'm coming to you. I'm going to come to you." And there are different levels. We're all in different places. We're all in process, so to speak, but we're at different levels. Some of us might just be saying, "God, I'm inviting you into this part of my life that has been ghettoized. I'm bringing you into that life." For some of us, it might be actually a full-scale redo. Saying, "God, I'm bringing you into my life. I'm coming to you. I'm not going to run anymore. I'm just coming to you now." Knowing that actually our response is not actually the initiative. He's already taken the initiative. It's just up to us to say, I'm coming to you. And in so doing, hopefully we can get the book of Daniel shaped view of God. Sovereign, living, keeping covenant, steadfast love God who chases after us, never lets us go. Ransacks the dictionary for all the words of darling to express his love for us. Let's pray. Lord, thank you that when we talk to you, you are real. You are a God who, you have called out to us. And sometimes, many times, we have not answered. We have run from you. Lord, in this moment, for each one in this room, for all of us, Lord, would you minister to us? Your healing, your love, your peace. Help us to know deeply, not only that we are sinful and broken. Yes, God, help us to know afresh that we are weak. We cannot do anything outside of you. But we are loved in a way that we could never imagine. Come now, Lord. Work in our hearts. Work in our hearts, Lord. Heal us. Help us to get a picture of who you are. In your name, amen.